Hello, welcome to Inside. Today we have invited a guest from the Atlantic Council. Our guest is Bronwyn Bruton. She is the director of the Africa Desk at the Atlantic Council, and we'll be discussing the Ethiopian political situation in the coming hour. Welcome to the program, Bronwyn.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, let's start by a brief introduction of the Atlantic Council.
Sure. So the Atlantic Council is a think tank, which basically means it's a bunch of experts who have backgrounds in various topics sitting together in a building, coming up with policy advice and convening meetings. So lots of papers. We host a lot of diplomats. And the Atlantic Council is one of the most famous think tanks in Washington, D.C., and we work on foreign policy. And I am the director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council.
The Council, along with other think tanks, do propose policy ideas to the executive branch and the legislative branch. And sometimes your staff are either former government officials, or your staff will be selected to head some government officials. Is that correct?
That is correct. And as you know, we've just had an election in the U.S. and everybody is talking about it. The Biden administration is in the process of filling those seats. And so a number of the people who are in the Atlantic Council are transitioning into government. And a number of people who have been in government will transition to the Atlantic Council. It's what we call a revolving door, essentially.
Okay. All right. Let's go to Ethiopia. So what is your current assessment of the Ethiopian political situation?
Look, I mean, I think it's, in the first place, I'd say it's complicated to know precisely what is happening in the north because of the information difficulties, the closing of the space to some media and the difficulties with some of the phone connections and the internet. So we could talk about Tigray, or we could talk more broadly about Ethiopia. And I personally would prefer to talk more about Ethiopia and perhaps a little less about Tigray, simply because so much attention, I think, has been given to the conflict in the north, and so little to the more broad situation in the country, though I'm sure we should probably discuss both. Let me say that I feel optimistic for Ethiopia. Despite the fact that the country is beset by so many crises, not least the locust infestation and the coronavirus pandemic, which is affecting the entire globe. But I am very enthused and excited to think about the elections that are coming up in June. I think that there's great reason to be hopeful that these will be the most free and fair elections that Ethiopia has had in decades. And I'm very eager to see the results of those elections. And I'm watching very closely the work of various political parties as they ready themselves in the run-up to the elections. But I do feel concerned about, in all honesty, the imprisonment of some individuals whose participation in the political discussion, I think, would be very helpful. And so I will also be very eager and watching what the government does over the next few months to resolve some of these outstanding court cases, and just to ensure that all of the nations of Ethiopia have a slate of candidates that represents them fully. And so I think those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, we will delve into each subject as we go in the interview. But I have to start with Tigray. As you know, a couple of months ago, there was a conflict between the federal government and the regional government in Tigray. It looks like the war, at least the hot war, is over. And it looks like the challenge now is reintegrating Tigray into the broader political environment. In the meantime, most of the West, most of the external media organization and governments have been critical of Dr. Abiy and his government and quite protective of TPLF. Would you care to comment on that? Would you agree with me?
Well, I think, and I've said it many times before, I think I would agree with you that the international community has a long-standing affection for the TPLF that is based on, I think, the very long cooperation, the security cooperation between Western governments and the TPLF, particularly in places like Somalia. I think another factor that perhaps hasn't been talked about enough is the fear that many Western officials have of a genocide in Tigray. One of the things that the TPLF managed to do very effectively at the start of the conflict, right after the assault on the Northern Command, was to begin making claims that the Tigrayan population faced an ethnic-based genocide at the hands of Ethiopian troops and Amhara militia. And the word genocide is a word that triggers a lot of fear and consternation in Western society, particularly after the Rwandan genocide and the failure of the US and the EU nations to step in a timely manner. And so anytime the genocide word is used persuasively, it triggers a series of alarm bells in Washington. Because I think one of the greatest fears that any official has is that they will be accused of doing nothing about genocide. And so I think what I want to be clear is I think that there are two separate issues here, where one of them is indeed the historical, inappropriate sort of sentimental connection to the TPLF, which in some individual cases is strong and real. And then the sort of the fear-based response of many other officials who just don't want to be on the wrong side of what might turn out to be a genocide. And so they're acting as cautiously as they possibly can. And personally in the process, I think ignoring some other truly horrific human rights violations, like the one that occurred at the Northern Command, like those that have been occurring against various Amhara populations. I think that their framework, because of the way that TPLF was able to position themselves at the start of the conflict, has been mostly to be afraid about the smaller Tigrayan population and to be only secondarily worried about everyone else, which is not helpful necessarily, but I do think they're two distinct problems.
Speaking of genocide, I think the Ethiopian political environment that the West, the United States and the West have been supported was very ethnocentric, if you will. And genocide, most of the time, as we have witnessed in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, most of the time comes out of identity politics or ethnic politics. And how do the West justify their support for ethnic politics, then not support a transition away from ethnocentric politics?
Well, I'm sure that if you were to ask most Western officials if they support an end to, what you might call ethnic segregation, a policy or a practice of ethnic segregation, they would say that they do. And they would say that they feel very supportive of the elections that are coming up and of Ethiopians' rights to change the constitution and to change the federal order and to come up with a new system of government that is not based on ethnic identity. But I think in the short term, they feel most concerned about stability. And that is the primary issue that we always face, whether you're talking about Nigeria or DRC or Ethiopia or Eritrea or any other country, is that primarily American officials are worried about stability and avoiding a loss of life and creating the kind of conflict that might open a space for extremist groups. In this case, an opening for al-Shabaab, for example. And so, as you've seen, it's been the case time and time again, when they're faced with an opportunity to do right. I mean, you could talk about the DRC elections recently, for example, and an opportunity to simply avoid bloodshed. They often err on the side of avoiding bloodshed. And I'm not saying that that's always a wrong decision, but I think in this particular case in Tigray, early on, there was a calculation made that TPLF could not be defeated militarily and that it was better to negotiate with them because of that. And there hasn't been really an examination of whether that was a good assumption so far. Very few groups have stepped back and say, gee, it looks like TPLF is militarily defeated. There may be some mopping up that's still going on. There may be pockets of conflict in the north, but it does appear that TPLF militarily is on the back foot and is unlikely to recover. So I think in some respects we're dealing with an outdated framework for the conflict, but also I think more than anything else with the desire to make sure that stability is regained and that the humanitarian situation normalizes and that the political structure of Ethiopia is a very distant second behind those concerns. And I think until we get past this sort of emergency idea that Tigray is in an emergency, it will be very difficult to refocus Western attention on what's happening with the federalism debate or even the elections, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Just one more question on this. You talked about stability, and we all want stability, but it looks like a stability for a short term might be creating the foundation of a genocide. In other words, what I'm trying to say is when Meles Zenawi marched into Addis with his army, I can understand the West, all international community, to support stabilizing the country. But when ethnic politics was rampant and when most of the non-ethnic Tigrayans were being oppressed, it's a matter of time before the situation changed. So why aren't the West, the intellectuals and the government officials, as much as they like stability, stability has to have two components. One is the immediate, the short-term one, and the long-term foundation of creating a democratic society.
Well, I think it comes down to a couple of things. And the first, I do believe, is the issue of genocide. I think that the issue of genocide is more important to Western officials than anything else. Even counterterrorism and counterterrorism concerns will pale next to the threat of a genocide. And as I said, TPLF made a very strong case, on the basis of it being a very small ethnicity in a military conflict, that a genocide could take place. And I think that Western concerns have not been reassured on that point. And so if I were giving advice to officials in Ethiopia, my first advice would be, it's very necessary to open the space, the internet, the telephone lines, allow the media, allow humanitarian access across the territory so that those concerns can be put to bed. And I believe that once the international press and international actors are assured of a minimum level of stability, that is that Tigrayans are not being slaughtered. And I think there's little evidence so far that they are, but not to the extent that satisfied Westerners, Western government officials. Once they're satisfied that humanitarian relief is flowing, and to a lesser extent, once they're satisfied that Tigray is on a path to its own free and fair elections, I think it will be possible very quickly to restore relations. I do think we're stuck in a kind of a holding pattern until that takes place, because it's very difficult if there's a fear of war crimes having taken place or potential genocide. Western governments are basically going to be very reluctant to talk about bigger issues or to normalize a relationship because they'll be afraid of something coming out that then embarrasses them down the road. And so again, I think it's most important to really focus on getting the access and the transparency up in the north.
Yeah, just for the record, though, the conflict was from the Tigrayan side and from the federal forces or even the Amara militia and special forces. It is not civilians against civilians. It is armed groups that have been fought. And naturally, wars have consequences, and we can, without a lot of evidence, we can assume there have been a lot of devastation in Tigray. Now, I want to proceed to the next area I want to cover. That's the elections. You already told me you are hopeful the election will be free and fair. As you know, the elections are like 5 months away, and Tigray will not hold an election. Now, the rest of Ethiopia, as there are a lot of instability, or there is a lot of sectarian politics where some political parties cannot go to some areas and campaign freely. And also the federal government is quite stretched in terms of its security forces to provide stability for all political parties. And some political organizations are already objecting to that, and they think there is no sufficient political stability to hold elections. Would you care to comment on that?
I am personally a little bit concerned about the elections. I believe that if they're held, they will be free and fair. I believe that the Electoral Commission will do a good job of ensuring that. But I think there are genuine risks around the election. You know, we in the United States just came out of our own presidential contest, and I don't think anybody would say that that Americans are more unified in the aftermath. You know, I think that when you have tribal politics, and in the United States, we definitely have tribal politics now, you have a winner and a loser. And in Ethiopia, you literally have tribal politics that are playing out on ethnic lines. And I do fear that Ethiopia going into elections in June, the contest will be decided on ethnic lines. And what that means is it's unlikely, in my view, and this is a worst case scenario, of course, but it's unlikely, in my view, that a majority of people are going to feel happy with the results of the election, which is, again, very similar to what we have in the US, where half the country is very happy with the results and half the country is really, really angry. And I think that then creates a situation where there's a high likelihood of violence in the wake of the polls. I hope that will not be the case. I hope that there will be coalitions that are formed. And there are, of course, a small handful of parties who are not running on ethnic lines. But the fear that I have is going into the elections before there is platforms established that go beyond ethnic concerns, and before there's been a national dialogue and some kind of a reconciliation, this may be viewed as a kind of winner-take-all contest. And so I somewhat agree with the concerns expressed by the opposition, who are also right to say that because of instability, it is very difficult to campaign. And it can be impossible for opposition groups in particular to go to certain areas and hold the rallies that they need to hold. And so in some respects, despite the government's best efforts, it may not be a level playing field. But again, I also feel it's very difficult to postpone the elections because, of course, that will lead to accusations against the government that it's taking an authoritarian turn and it's delaying the elections in order not to lose power. So in a sense, it's a no-win situation. But I will say I commend the opposition for saying that the elections should not potentially take place because they allow the space for a constructive solution when they do that.
As you said, the government is in no-win situation because even one of the flashpoints with the Tigray regional government was the postponement of the election. So if the government has no political space to postpone the election, and given the societal divisions created over the last 27, 30 years, as you said, it is tribal politics. So in these circumstances, given the situation on the ground, what should be the role of the United States? What should be the role of the West in terms of stabilizing and probably creating a level playing field for the coming election?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I had more optimism about the capability of the West to play a constructive role here. You know, I think I am personally a little bit disappointed by the response of Western governments to the situation in Tigray. I think that reluctance to recognize the operation as a law enforcement effort has probably hurt the credibility of international actors inside of Ethiopia. And when you have low credibility, it can be hard to intervene in a constructive way. Certainly, the U.S. has some expertise, technical expertise, when it comes to conducting elections and observing elections and civic education. And I'm sure that the United States could play a role. But I almost feel that what would be most useful is what you alluded to earlier, which is to open a space for a discussion about whether it is the right time to hold elections. Because, as I said, it's difficult for Abiy to initiate that conversation. It may be difficult for the U.S. or Europe to initiate it as well. I think potentially the best thing that the U.S. could do is reiterate calls for a national dialogue. And if there is an open national dialogue, it may be possible to come to a consensus between the PP and the opposition parties about when elections should be held. And if that could happen, that would be very useful, because I think it would insulate Dr. Abiy from any criticism. You know, if you had a national dialogue process and the opposition were to lead calls to say, look, we don't have the security that we need, we don't have the time that we need for a free and fair poll, we want to push it back 6 months or whatever it is, then the situation becomes much easier. So I would hope if there's anything that the U.S. could do, it would be to try to magnify calls for this national dialogue process and perhaps provide some technical support for that process as well. But there is a question about the credibility of the U.S., and perhaps you know more about that than I do, even.
Yeah, I think the other option, I think, is for the election to happen, but not to expect any free and fair election, not a perfect election, but then to have the dialogue or the reconciliation after that. 6 months is not sufficient. I mean, if we look at what happened in South Africa, most Ethiopians, even in the government, believe that the future of Ethiopia has to be decided through national reconciliation. But to do that, it takes time. And the government seems to be suggesting the election because it is in the constitution and the reconciliation cannot be outside of cannot overrule the constitution. The reconciliation have to come to after the election. So do you think the West should provide the political cover for the government to hold the election and of course work to make it as free and fair as possible, but not to raise expectation that it will be a perfect election?
You know, my thinking on this is very influenced by my long experience in Somalia. And I know it's somewhat insulting to compare Ethiopia and Somalia, so I apologize for that, and I hope you'll forgive me for raising it. Yeah. But, you know, I think one of the things that I learned again and again from the process after the Siad Barre regime is that they attempted to have a national reconciliation and it didn't work on a schedule. And so then they went to elections thinking that, well, you know, they'll have these elections and then after that they can do the national reconciliation process. But what happens is then that there's an idea in people's minds that whoever wins the elections will set the terms for national reconciliation and will set the terms for revising the Constitution and will set the terms for whether there will be a federalist structure or a unitary structure, whether you'll have ethnic federalism or federalism based on a different set of criteria. And so I fear that, again, that will ramp up pressure so that people feel, you know, the Oromo will feel if we have an Oromo leader, then we will have a better experience in the reconciliation process. And the Amhara will feel if we have an Amhara leader, we'll have a better a chance of getting the result we want from the reconciliation process. And so my personal feeling is that it is better to delay the elections and have the conversation first so that there's less pressure on the outcome of the presidential and parliamentary polls themselves. I just think that, again, it's my personal opinion. I defer to others, and I'm not Ethiopian, so I don't necessarily have a platform for saying it. But my personal feeling would be that the more you can do to make everybody feel that they can all win, and that the entire future of Ethiopia isn't riding on what happens at this next vote, would be very useful. And I do think it would be good for the United States and other external actors to make it clear that they will accept the space and time that's needed for a national dialogue, as opposed to saying, we will cut off funding and we will regard the government as illegitimate, etc. Especially if, as I said, there is a strong support for postponement among the opposition parties, and especially if it's clear that the national dialogue will take place. But that's only my personal view.
No, I actually used to advocate what you just said, the national reconciliation should come before an election. But we are 5 months from the election and the government hasn't made up its mind. Also, when we look at the South African Truth and Reconciliation, the duration was much longer. Non-political actors were participants. There was international participation. So, given the realistic situation, I think some are saying that the best option, again, to ensure the stability of the country and also the challenges of the Nile and the Sudan and all that, even though this is not our first choice, we have to accept it as the list of the worst choices and delay the reconciliation. So, but with that, let me go to the next question. So, as you know, one of the issues for the Ethiopian government is that is coming from the West, that is Sudan, and behind Sudan, Egypt. It started about the Nile, the amount of water or filling of the dam, but now it has come to territorial claims by the Sudan. How would you characterize what's going on between Sudan and Ethiopia?
Well, I'd say it's difficult to characterize it because, again, as in Tigray, there's a lot of misinformation that's spinning around in the press. And so it can be a little bit difficult to understand exactly what's taking place, whether what military actions have taken place, who's crossed the lines, who's launched attacks. None of that is very clear to me at this moment, or the position of the troops is not very clear. I would say that I think the issue of Egypt is a very worrying one. And the complicating factor of the GERD and the allocation of the Nile waters obviously means that this is more than a dispute over a small, albeit very, very fertile and important piece of land. I personally have some confidence that Sudan and Ethiopia will be able to work through this. The border area has always been porous, and there's always been traffic, very free traffic across it. Historically, at least for the last few decades, that territory has been occupied by Ethiopians. At the same time, I don't really think there is a dispute over the location of the border. I think both Sudan and Ethiopia agree where the demarcated, it's not physically demarcated, but they know where the actual border territory is. And so in a sense, this is not a question of fighting over territory, but of managing access to it. And I feel that it's likely that the dispute will calm down. I hope in particular that with the Biden administration coming in, that Egypt will be feel less empowered to take aggressive action in the Horn of Africa. It was a great problem in the Trump administration, of course, that President Trump seemed to encourage Egypt in pursuing a military solution to the Nile problem. And I believe that with the Trump administration leaving, it will hopefully be easier to practice diplomacy and for the sides to think that their best course of action is through a dialogue. I would also point out that at the moment there's a huge realignment taking place around Tigray, that there are shifts in possession, not only between Sudan and Ethiopia, but between the Amhara and the Tigrayans, between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And so the defeat of the TPLF is basically, it's causing something of a restructuring and a recapturing of territory that had been held for a long time. And so this is a shaking out, so to speak, that is going to play out over a number of months. And I think the most important thing is to just ensure that it doesn't spark a wider conflict. I do have confidence in the ability of Prime Minister Abiy to negotiate out of this, but I will feel better when the Biden administration is in place and can also play the role of encouraging conversation as opposed to weaponry.
Yeah, as you said, Egypt seems to be taking advantage of the situation. Egypt thinks Ethiopia is overextended its forces, so it can get its way by using Sudan for its purposes. But as you know, Ethiopia, the Nile, the Blue Nile, the most water comes from Ethiopia. Ethiopia doesn't use it, so it has the natural right to use it. As you said, the Trump administration unfortunately got involved in the wrong way, and it didn't help the situation. And I hope, as you said, the Biden administration will help us. But that's where I want to go next. So what do you think will be the Biden administration policy to Ethiopia? As you mentioned, Trump, for the most part, ignored Africa, really, at least in terms of Abiy, at least in terms of the most recent conflict with Tigray. The US position was quite partial towards Dr. Abiy and Ethiopia, which is good. But do you think Trump, Biden's administration will follow through, or they will change their policy?
I think a lot of it depends on, as I said, the opening of the space in Tigray. I believe that if Dr. Abiy is successful in giving access to foreign reporters and local reporters in the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, for example, and they find that there haven't been war crimes committed by government forces and there hasn't been a genocide of Tigrayans, and they are able to resettle people, I think that the Biden administration has a lot of incentives to maintain the close partnership between the U.S. and Ethiopia. Most definitely a primary concern for President Biden will be Somalia. And the reality is that Ethiopia is very important in Somalia. Because it's one of a few nations that's really preventing al-Shabaab from taking control of Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab control of Mogadishu would be an absolute crisis for the Biden administration. And of course, stability in Ethiopia would be for the Biden administration. And national security interests always come first. And so I think that most likely, particularly if Dr. Abiy is able to make some important gestures to reassure the U.S. about his intentions, and that will include free and fair elections, of course. I believe that relations can be put back on track very quickly. I think there's perhaps a little bit more work to be done with the EU, but I believe the EU will follow along as well. For all of the current tensions in the bilateral relationships, I don't doubt that the West wants to see a stable Ethiopia, an Ethiopia that can support security objectives, as in Somalia, an Ethiopia that can contribute to peacekeeping missions as it always has, and an Ethiopia that can lead regional integration in East Africa, particularly at a moment when there's great promise on the economic front because of the potential for Ethiopia through the peace agreement with Eritrea to get access to the sea, and when the GERD is going to make it possible to do the kind of manufacturing that Ethiopia hasn't been able to perform because of electricity and energy shortages. So this is a real moment of promise. And I think that, again, when we get past this feeling of great crisis, I think that will become clear. But it's mostly a question of responsibly navigating that. And then beyond that, I think that the future looks very bright. And I think that relations will be very good. Dependent, of course, upon the idea of normalizing the situation in Tigray and getting to a pathway to elections or national dialogue. I really think the only thing that the West wants to see is that Dr. Abiy is better than the TPLF. And it's not a very high bar.
I agree, but I want to raise a couple of issues since you mentioned the genocide a couple of times. Except within the propaganda circles of TPLF, there is no claim of genocide. I mean, there are many Tigrayans who are against TPLF. I'm talking about who reside in Mekelle and also who are ethnic Tigrayans in the army itself that stayed. And the claim of genocide particularly comes from diaspora Tagaru and their foreign-based supporters. So one is, I think, if there is genocide, we all agree it should be addressed. But I think to base a policy on a suspicion doesn't sound right. Number two is, I wanted to raise this with you. Tigray is 5% of Ethiopia. Even if the Tigray condition is not that stable, the West has to worry about 95% of the country, more than 100 million people. Whether their national security depends on the stability of Ethiopia or whether it is to discourage migration to Europe, the bulk of it will come from the rest of Ethiopia. So why would the West be so suffocated by the TPLF propaganda that it does not want to take a constructive role in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I mean, I share your frustration. I think that the situation in Tigray has gotten an outsized amount of attention, particularly because I suspect when all is said and done, that we will find that there has been more carnage on the Amhara, on the Amhara populations than there has been on the Tigrayans by a lot. And I honestly think that the West is going to look back and have to really take stock of all of the mistakes that they made in dealing with this crisis, from the original calls for negotiation to the intensive focus on the well-being of the Tigrayan population at the expense of many others. And I do also agree that if you look at the fate of Ethiopia writ large, the unhappiness of the Oromo population is far more relevant to the stability of Ethiopia than the happiness of the Tigrayan population, simply by virtue of mathematics, because the Oromo are a much larger percentage of the population, and they're located in a very important part of the country, whereas many African nations are dealing with northern insurgencies far away from their capitals. And so I think in a very worst case scenario, if the TPLF were able to launch what they're calling a prolonged insurgency, it's not clear to me that it would have a very detrimental effect on Ethiopia as a whole. But none of that is very clear in the minds of Western policymakers, I think. And as we said in the beginning, part of that is because there is a sentimental attachment to the TPLF, and because they get so much of their information from the TPLF, which is a big problem. And the other issue is, as we said too, the genocide. I agree with you. I don't think that there has been a lot of evidence put forth that there are genocidal acts taking place in Tigray. There's obviously a great deal of suffering and displacement and concern about the lack of access for humanitarian workers. But many of the claims that have been made have been debunked. Most recently, the idea that there were thousands of Somali soldiers forced to fight in Tigray. But the problem is that it's very, very difficult, tremendously difficult for a normal sort of American official who's hearing all of these rumors to start figuring out what's real and what isn't. I mean, even me, I watch the situation in Tigray all day, every day almost. And I find it very, very confidence what's true and what isn't, because there is so much spinning around in the internet, and such a climate of misinformation, that very few people are going to feel confident saying what's real and what isn't, which is a terrible thing for both sides, in all honesty. And so I really think that it is going to be a case of allowing international reporters who are trusted, to get in there and say, well, we didn't find that many bodies. We didn't find evidence of a really ethnic-based cleansing taking place. And then at that point, I think international attention will be able to shift, to some of the more important issues facing Ethiopia. But it's unfortunate that that is the case. I'm not saying it should be. I'm just saying that that's how I feel it is.
Mm-hmm. So I want to come back to the Biden administration. For Ethiopians like me, even though I voted for Biden, the people he selected are officials from the Obama and the Clinton administration. The National Security Advisor, Drc Sullivan, has already written a couple of months ago about Tigray massacre, and without sufficient information. Even the Secretary of State designee, Antony Blinken, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary during the Obama administration. And as we know, the Clinton administration and Secretary Clinton also, when she was at the State Department, were extremely pro-TPLF. In spite of the abundance of evidence that TPLF was oppressive and the government was not stable, ethnic federalism will never work, these are people who were financing and politically supporting the TPLF. Is there anything you can say to Ethiopians like me, Ethiopian Americans like me, that will persuade us that the Biden administration, at least the people who are coming to power in the State Department, will be impartial and will look at other Ethiopians fairly?
All that I can say is that all American officials are going to be guided primarily by the interests of the American people. And if they determine that it is in the interests of the American people to have a good relationship with Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is providing troops in Somalia, because Ethiopian instability would be a crisis for the United States, then that's what they'll do. And there's no personal sentimentality that will be more important than that. I mean, I can even confidently say that about somebody like Susan Rice. She is not going to let, even assuming, let's say, for the sake of argument, that she was really deeply committed to TPLF, she would not allow that to be more important than the well-being of the American people. And I think that the things that drove the Obama administration to collaborate with the TPLF will drive the Biden administration to collaborate with whoever is in power in Ethiopia after these elections. That I can say with real confidence. The idea of an American administration deciding to be unsupportive and unhelpful to Dr. Abiy or whoever replaces him, as Ethiopia is facing these existential challenges, would be really hard for me to imagine. Really hard, because you have to think, what happens to the US if the Ethiopian government fails? We would have a situation where al-Shabaab could run over the whole of East Africa and beyond, and where the extremist groups in the Maghreb Sahel could come over, to this side of Africa as well, and you would have a swath of instability that would go up into Yemen and across over, to Nigeria, all the way up through North Africa, and that would be a crisis of really biblical proportions. And I really don't think the Biden administration wants to deal with that. They don't even want to deal with the idea of al-Shabaab taking over Mogadishu, which would probably happen if Ethiopia decides not to be cooperative in the peacekeeping mission. And so I'd say, Abiy has a lot of leverage And it's the same leverage that the TPLF had. I would even say that there's a case for concern that once this crisis in Tigray is passed, that the U.S. will not do as much as it should to pressure Dr. Abiy to do the right things. Because the history of the U.S. is, whether it's you're talking about Museveni in Uganda or, Meles in the days of the TPLF or any number of other authoritarian leaders, Djibouti, Burundi, the history has normally been to get along with them in order to advance counterterrorism objectives. And given the number of people who were in the Obama administration who are now in the Biden team, my fear is that that will continue. And I personally would like to see a U.S. that is more balanced. I think it would be in Ethiopia. Yeah.
Go ahead, finish.
No, I was just saying that my fear is actually almost the opposite one, which is just that the easiest thing to do will be to embrace the idea of the Tigray crisis ending and free and fair elections, whether they are as free and fair as they need to be. And then I think it will be very easy for the Biden administration to turn its attention somewhere else. The COVID disaster and the economic recovery and China and North Korea and, the endless other things that the U.S. needs to concentrate on. And so, over the longer term, I think, it's really important for the Ethiopian people to demand a different policy. If this isn't even just about Ethiopia, this is just about the way that the United States has prioritized counterterrorism, very narrow ideas of counterterrorism above and beyond democracy, and really having a strong relationship with the people of East Africa. And I hope that that will change under a new Biden administration. I truly do. And on the plus side, I think counterterrorism will be a lot less important, as we in the United States shift our focus to China. But again, I would worry more about the U.S. just giving the kind of pass to the PP that they gave to the TPLF in the past.
So finally, a couple of questions. One, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians. I'm sure you have dealt with them in the Washington, in the DMV area. There are many. We have a lot of businesses and we are visible. So many of us are US citizens. We vote. So I want you to say a few things, how we can influence our executive branch and legislative branch to address our issues.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you that that kind of activism is not what I've done very much in my own career. And so community organizing, for example, and pressuring Congress as a constituent, especially as a constituent of DC, where we don't actually have a member of Congress. I'm not sure that I can offer great advice, but I think there are some organizations here in the US that are doing a wonderful job already. The EAC, for example, of really organizing Ethiopians and making their voice heard as a constituency, as you said, as a voting bloc. And so understanding where you have the largest number of Ethiopians, that Washington, D.C. is a great example, and really organizing those people into a group who can influence votes and can influence fundraising is a really important way of getting your concerns across. Getting a couple of members of Congress who realize that this is something that affects their likelihood of being reelected or surviving a primary. That's a great goal to work towards. And you're right. I mean, the Ethiopian community is very large in the United States, very large indeed, and really deserves to have a voice in the setting of policy.
So how did you get involved with Ethiopia?
My first visits to Ethiopia were many years ago in the early 2000s, when I worked for the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which I don't know if you know NED, but they make grants. Okay. Yeah, they are funded by the U.S. government. They make grants to human rights groups and CSOs. And I was managing their program in Ethiopia, in all of East and Southern Africa, in fact. So I used to travel to Ethiopia 3 or 4 times a year, and Somalia, Uganda, all of those other places. And because of that work with the CSOs and the human rights groups, I had a very I had an understanding of what was really happening and the repression that they were experiencing at the hands of TPLF. And I was fortunate to be able to travel in places like the Ogaden, which are often not accessible to U.S. officials because TPLF wasn't allowing them to travel. And so for that reason, I had very bad experiences with the TPLF a couple of times early on, and had an understanding of what they what they were actually doing as opposed to the rosy picture they were able to paint in Washington.
So these are all the questions I have. If I have forgotten something, I want to give you a chance to say something you want to say, if you have something to say.
No, I really thank you. This was a very long interview. I feel like you put me through my paces. I hope I didn't say anything wrong. I know if I said anything, if I did say anything wrong, your viewers will definitely tell me.
No. This is what we want. We want Ethiopians to learn to appreciate difference of opinions. So you are always welcome on this program. I hope to keep in touch with you. And thank you very much. I appreciate you coming to my program.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful to you for allowing me to share so many views. It's really kind of you.
Thank you very much. This was Insight. We will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye.